please?
Sure. 1098-765-4321. 23.
Good. Sound good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Representative Dingle. Just want to try again before the hearing officially starts. Could we do an audio visual check, please?
Yes. Oh my God. When?
44 last night. Josie Benny Silverberg.
Josie? Josie?
Josie.
Oh my God. Cute. And what's the middle name?
Benny, Benny. Born April 5th at 8:44, 5 pounds, 13 ounces. She needed oxygen and monitoring after birth, and she's still in the oxygen. It was a little scary, but she's doing well. That's not super unexpected.
5 pounds and how much?
13 ounces.
That's pretty good weight, almost 6 pounds.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Great. Thank you.
And to everyone, and before we begin today, and part of the, and I think Don, uh, through various legal issues. I didn't want to bring something that was looking forward to it. So I apologize for the delay. And at this point, if we may, in honor of our friend Don Young, pausing for a moment of silence and reflection, and then I will continue from there. Thank you very much. And Don was the former chair of this committee, former chair of the Transportation Committee. He was my colleague, a friend, and a force to be reckoned with, not only in this committee setting, but in Congress. I'm deeply saddened by Don's loss and extend my sincerest condolences to his wife, Annie, his family, friends, and the staff that served him so well. It may sound strange to say that we are shocked at the news of Don's passing, but the size of his personality, his energy, and his impact on the institution make it hard to believe that he is really gone. Representative Young was a pillar of Alaska, leaving behind a legacy as immense as that state. We all are to be judged by the improvements that we have made in the lives of our constituents, and we should all aspire to approach Don's record on that. Far too many politicians have secret motives. Not Don. It was Alaska first, last, and always. On the Natural Resources Committee, Don was a fierce champion of Alaskan Natives and all Indigenous people. He fought to combat the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, bolster tribal sovereignty, and expand economic opportunity and access to health care for tribal communities. Not only have Alaskans and Indigenous peoples lost a champion, so have Americans' fisheries and the millions of Americans who depend on them for their livelihoods and their sustenance. Don's role in protecting healthy and sustainable fish populations is too large to quantify. We can only summarize by saying that the people and resources he worked to protect are far better off thanks to his lifetime of service. Don Young will forever be an icon for Alaska, our committee and to our committee and for Congress. He was a passionate, devoted, often obstinate, and endearing bull moose of a man and a colleague. And I will miss him, as others will too. Somebody will replace Don Young as the representative from Alaska. And that is the process of our democracy, and that's what will occur. But a true replacement of that legacy and that power and that energy that Don put into this job is going to be very difficult if not impossible, to replace. I know that many of my colleagues have already spoken about Don in recent days, including on the House floor and in our committee proceedings. But before we turn to the business at hand today, I will recognize any members who wish to share any words about our colleague. And with that, let me turn to Ranking Member Westerman. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and thank you for those kind words about our colleague, Don Young. And, you know, it's a surreal moment when this committee's meeting without his physical presence here. You know, we call Don Young a mentor. We call Don Young a friend. And I was thinking back from the first time I ever met Don, he started that mentoring process. And, you know, to be on this committee and to have a personality as big as Don, to be an encourager, to be someone to coach you on how to get things done, because Don was about getting things done. He was really about getting things done for Alaska, but he wanted everybody to be successful, and he had such a wealth of knowledge that he shared with us. And that led into friendships where you could talk to Don about you know, whatever was on your mind. And some of those days sitting on the House floor by Don in his seat and just hearing him expound on life are memories that I'll never forget. And that exterior and that gruff voice that Don's going to be remembered by a lot, and that voice that's probably in all of our heads. We know that when you got to know Don, there was a heart that was as big as Alaska inside, and he cared about people. And, you know, really the best way to talk about Don Young is to tell the stories about Don Young that we've all got. And, you know, a personal story, I remember going to Alaska, my first trip to Alaska, and it was a trip with Don, and I ended up on a boat with Don all day long. And my regret is I didn't have a video camera recording it, because I heard story after story. You know, what an amazing life. Someone that moved to Alaska when it was a territory. He ran a 100-mile trap line with a dog sled. It was like reading a story out of Outdoor Life, except you were sitting by Don actually hearing it, the life that he lived. A boat captain, a school teacher, and eventually, you know, the longest serving Republican member of the House. There's a story many of you all remember, Lisa Pittman, who sat here to the right on this committee for a long time. And she tells about 1995 when Don was chairman of the committee, and his wife, Lou, would come and sit in the back of the room. And she said partway through the hearing that someone brought a note up from Lou, and she didn't know what it was going to say, but Don opened it up, and it said, "You need to smile more." And of course, it caused Don to have a big smile on his face. You know, just lots of stories. A lot of people don't realize this, but in 1973, when Gerald Ford was a member of the House, he made the appointment to Don on this committee. And it was later when Don authored the Magnus and Stevens bill that regulates fisheries. It so happened that President Ford was on a trip and invited Don to fly on Air Force One because they had to go through Alaska to refuel. And on that trip, the president was pressing Don about this new law and whether he was going to sign it or not. So the Defense Department was against it. The State Department was against it because it allowed a 200-mile jurisdictional change on federal waters. So Don ends up debating the Secretary of State about the merits of this bill. He gets off the plane and he doesn't know how it's going to end, but eventually President Ford signs the bill, and you know that was the day that Don Young won the debate with Henry Kissinger. So he was debating about the merits of the bill. We're going to miss Don. We're going to miss his larger-than-life personality, but I can say that America and this committee has been blessed by the service of Don Young, who was the congressman for all of Alaska. My deepest sympathy goes out to Ann and his family and to his staff. And I will say with a grateful heart, thank you, Don Young, for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman. Yeah, I recall those moments when Don would come up to you. It was never a whisper, and say, as part of his mentoring with me, it was always, he'd come up to me, he says, Grajava, how can you be so wrong? And let me recognize Mr. Soto, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Don Young, Dean of the House. He loved his family. He loved Alaska. And he lived so many lives, right? When he told me he played professional football, I was like, what? You played professional football? Back in the CFL, or the older league there, he'd tell me stories about how he was a teenager when Alaska became a state. Just wow types of moments. Of course, tugboat captain, among others. He was old school, right? And surprisingly bipartisan, right? When we worked on infrastructure and other issues, he was one of the folks who crossed the aisle, and he'd urge us to cross the aisle too. And he was quick to come to your aid when he thought you were right and to point out your errors when he thought you were wrong. I was honored to work with him to support indigenous peoples, protecting fisheries. He was a champion of Puerto Rico. I know Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon and I can speak about that at length. And of course, veterans, which is why, Chairman, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. Before his passing, Congressman Young and I were working on new legislation that he had authored to support veterans participating in conservation. I'm proud to announce that that bill was filed this morning, the Don Young Veterans Advancing Conservation Act. As a nation, we spend an average of $1.5 million training a single special operations service member. However, in many cases, that training is no longer used by our country when they separate from the military. The Veterans Advancing Conservation Act, named after Don Young, aims to help nonprofit organizations who work with veterans on marine conservation to create a new grant program at NOAA to provide grants to nonprofit groups that hire, retrain, and redeploy veterans to conduct coastal, Great Lakes, and underwater conservation missions. It authorizes grant funds to nonprofits to train veterans and military-trained combat divers to work alongside scientists and environmentalists on marine conservation missions. Think of all those Navy SEALs and other who are familiar with incredible underwater training. And so I'm honored to file this today in agreement with his staff and name it after Don Young, the Don Young Veterans Advancing Conservation Act. And Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. Mr. Lamborn, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to associate myself with the remarks that have already been made, and I will miss Don. He was a force of nature. He was unique, and there'll never be another one like him. I served with him for almost 16 years, about a third of his tenure here, and I had an office on the same floor as him, so I'd walk by his office a lot, and the door would be open, and to get into his office, you first encounter this huge stuffed brown bear that seemed like it was about 10 feet high, and maybe it was actually, literally. If you go to the right in his lead shop, there'd be a lot of people working, and it was a huge office, by the way, amazingly huge. But there'd be stuffed heads from animals from all over the world, and if you go left into his office, the same thing, except on a smaller scale because it was a smaller office. And he would show me pictures where he served with Gerald Ford and Nixon and up until the present day. And if I have the dates right, he would have been about 27 or so when the Alaska became a state. And if I may have this wrong, but I think he told me he was in the territorial legislature in his late 20s. But in any case, he'd served in the Alaska legislature, and then, of course, here for almost 50 years. And the last thing I'll say is that I went to a small Bible study with him on Thursday afternoons on many occasions, and he was just the same genuine person there as here. It's one of those meetings where no staff and no outsiders are allowed, so people can speak their mind without any fear of it getting outside the room, if that's ever necessary. And in any case, he was very genuine. You know, he was, what you saw is what you got. He was the same exact person, and he was a person of genuine faith also. As a person, he was maybe a little rough around the edges, but he had a genuine faith in our Savior and in God and the Bible that really impressed me. And he was kind of a young Christian in some ways. It hadn't been that long in his life that he had made a decision to really turn his life over. And so he was just an amazing guy, and he will truly be missed. I know I'll see him again in heaven, but he is someone that I will truly miss here. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Casey wanted to be recognized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, colleagues. It's great to be with us here as we remember our late great colleague, Don Young, and I certainly embrace everything that has been said about the Dean of the House. Larger-than-life personality was used, authenticity, intolerance for division and partisanship for their own sake, certainly passion for Alaska and the House and this committee, and yeah, we all have our own stories about Don. I remember one of mine is when I came back to the House and went to reintroduce myself to Mr. Young sitting on the House floor in his accustomed seat. And I went up to him all eager to kind of engage him again as a colleague. And the seat next to him was empty, and I made the mistake of sitting down in that seat. And he said, "Well, Mr. Case, it's good to see you, but that seat is reserved for Mr. Mast." And I went, "Oh, excuse me." And I stood up and commenced my re-engagement with Don Young standing in front of the Dean of the House. You know, I wanted to remember him for a couple of areas that are perhaps a little bit more specific to our part of the world, the part of the world that is the United States and beyond, west of the continental United States, because there, Hawaii and Alaska have long shared a common enemy, being the continental United States in many ways. And there was a special relationship, really, from that perspective. The history of Alaska and Hawaii go back a long way, actually, to pre-statehood, when we both were up for statehood. It had been almost 50 years since the last state. This is the 1950s. And there were powerful entrenched interests in Congress against both of us becoming states for slightly different reasons. But nonetheless, in those late 50s, we joined forces and conspired with each other to help each other out. And we determined that Alaska had the better chance. And if Alaska was admitted, Hawaii would be admitted after that. And that's how it went down. Alaska came in early 1959, and literally 2 months later, with Alaska's vote, Hawaii's Admissions Act was passed, and we came in later, and that started a long and very, very productive alliance and friendship that has gone on over the course of now 3 generations between the members from Hawaii and Alaska. And Don embraced that when he got here only 14 years after statehood. He was always a friend of Hawaii. We were always a friend of Alaska. I actually counted this up, and he was on somewhere in the range of 71 Hawaii-specific bills over the years, and certainly I'm on a number of bills that I probably wouldn't be on, but that Don Young asked me to be on those bills for Alaska, and so we just really appreciate his friendship and certainly look forward to continuing that relationship. I think the second thing that I wanted to say, and it's already been referenced, was that he was a true friend of Indigenous peoples everywhere. He understood Indigenous peoples. He understood the depths of their histories, of their cultures, of their challenges. He, of course, came to this knowledge in Alaska, but he understood that, for example, that embraced the Native Hawaiians, who have their own specific challenges, but he took the time to understand that. And certainly through him, I think we, being Hawaii and Native Hawaiians and others, came to understand Alaska Natives and to understand that we had the same basic goals. And so we remember him particularly for his championing of those issues in this committee and beyond. we've really lost a friend from that perspective. And then finally, Don was a true friend of the Pacific. He loved the Pacific. I don't know where this exactly came from. He certainly was from the Pacific. Of course, Alaska is of the Pacific. He certainly understood island peoples and island cultures. And he came to an appreciation of the Pacific, of course, because he was a patriot, understood how much blood had been shed in the Second World War, understood that there was an obligation post-Second World War and continuing through today to assist the Pacific in every which way. And so in 2019, he joined a number of us on a bipartisan basis to found our congressional Pacific Islands Caucus, which is specific to the islands of the Pacific. He was an active member of that caucus. In fact, one of the very last events that he attended and participated in, which was literally 2 days before he died, was a Pacific Islands Caucus presentation of an effort led by the East-West Center in Honolulu and the U.S. Department of State about the U.S. Pacific matters to why the U.S. matters to the Pacific and why the Pacific Islands matter to the United States. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. He charmed everybody in the room. He reflected his understanding, his passion, his love of the Pacific. And it was a great person to really have on our team. And so, I join all of us in missing the multidimensional sides of this incredible public servant. But we're going to miss him in Hawaii and the Pacific, and we certainly look forward to carrying on his legacy beyond. And so, as we say in Hawaii, aloha oi, until we meet again.
Thank you, sir. Does anyone wish to be recognized? Mr. Whitman, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also reflect with my colleagues on Don Young's great service to our nation and obviously to the people of Alaska. He was a tireless advocate for Alaska. He was also a tireless advocate for our natural resources. He was indeed an avid fisherman and outdoorsman. I know that he had spent many years out in the wild there, as we heard his stories about working a trap line. He also did some commercial fishing. I never forget him telling me a story about how when he was a young person, he had a raccoon as a pet. And I thought, wow, I see where Don Young got his personality from, because we know that raccoons are pretty raucous and untamed, and that was Don Young in a nutshell. So I see that the wildlife had a distinct influence on his life. He also was very passionate about fisheries and making sure that we did the right thing in managing fisheries. In fact, back in the day, the most significant fisheries management bill is the Magnus and Stevens Act, named after Senator Magnuson and Senator Stevens, Senator Stevens being from the state of Alaska. Don Young had sponsored the same bill on the House side with the member from Massachusetts, Jerry Studds. Now, Don would argue that the bill should have been named after Mr. Young and Mr. Studds on the House side rather than Senator Magnuson and Senator Stevens on the Senate side. So you can imagine what the outcome would have been if Don had his wish. That being said, he was very, very adamant about making sure that we all understood the value of fisheries, and especially the value of fisheries, not just to Alaska. And listen, Don could be parochial at times, but he also had a very expansive view about what we needed to do to protect our natural resources and to make sure that we were not only proper stewards of the resources, but that we also utilize them in responsible ways. So he was one that was very much the conservationist, very much in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt. Don was always a tireless advocate for Alaska, and I remember him relentlessly asking me the question, Rob, when are you coming to Alaska? And Don, I didn't have a chance to go to Alaska while you were here on Earth, but I can promise you that I will fulfill your request and I will go and visit Alaska because of the passion that he showed for not only the great state of Alaska, but for our nation and for our natural resources. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Let me recognize gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, please.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva, for allowing each of us to go around and share our memories and impressions and how we have been changed by Don Young, the Dean of the House. As some of you might have known him for 16 years, I knew him for 16 months. But even in those 16 months, my understanding of how this institution works is completely changed, because I remember that first day when I started up the subcommittee on Indigenous peoples, and Don Young said, "Madam Chair, let me tell you what I think. We need to just solve this. We need to just fix the injustices facing Native American, Indigenous peoples, Native Alaskans, Native Hawaiians. Let's just fix it. Let's just solve it." And I think it was that perspective of that we could work together on the big things that affect the people that we care about, which is going to change my perspective of the rest of my career here in Congress, that it can be very focused on solving the problem, very focused on the people who are most impacted. And I too have my chair story with Dean Young, and it was slightly the opposite of "don't sit here." He just thought it would be hilarious. Everyone and sat on his chair. He said, "I want you to meet me on the floor of the House. Everyone knows where my chair is. You just sit there, and then they'll all wonder who you are." And I was like, so I went and I said, "Where's Don Young's chair?" And everybody, they gave me a look, and somebody told the story, and I sat next to his chair and waited for him to meet me, because I am, I might be new to Congress, but I'm not that new to jokes. But one of the things that really is clear is that he worked on such a bipartisan basis. I ended up co-leading bills with him. He led co-led my bills, but he also cared about the bills that were coming out of the subcommittee on Indigenous peoples. And I know he fought hard for like a package of bills that was bipartisan, that was Republicans and Democrats. He believed in getting stuff done, and let's just solve this. And those were some of the final things that I was working with him on. And I know that he cared deeply about addressing the Indian Health Service to make sure that we could get funding that was necessary to keep those in Alaska who live in rural communities and need to rely on the Indian Health Service, but recognizing as well how important it is for those in New Mexico who need to rely on the Indian Health Service. And I know that those, I have heard that those might have been some of his last congressional directives of getting things done, is to get that bill done. And I know personally, because we were working with him, the week before we lost him on these package of bills we were working on. So I think a great way for us to remember Dean Young is not just to thank him and eulogize him in this moment, but actually pass into law those things that he cared about, to honor him by honoring those people and communities and Indigenous wisdom that he was trying to bring forth. And I can tell you that I will work on that, and I will ask many of you to share that work with me, because I think it is important that we honor him with something that doesn't have those last two, but that does recognize the hard work he did for everybody, bridging those distances, those miles and those oceans from Alaska to the Pueblos of New Mexico to the Indigenous people of the Hawaiian Islands. And with that, I reeled back, and I look forward to working with you all in the memory and in the spirit of Dean Young. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Stubber, you recognize, sir?
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. First and foremost, I'd like to join my colleagues in celebrating the life of the representative for all of Alaska, Dean of the House, Don Young. This House will never be the same. Don Young changed this institution for the better. Although I only served with him for the last 3 years of his magnificent career, I was pleased to call him a friend and a mentor. His two portraits commemorating his leadership as chairman of both the Natural Resources and Transportation and Infrastructure underscore his leadership on responsible development issues. And when he presided over this body to earn that portrait, he fought for Alaska as ranking member and as chairman emeritus. Chairman, he fought for Alaska. When members from across the country tried to shut down his development in his home state, he was always one step ahead fighting for Alaska. His passionate floor speeches, defending issues such as the rightful development of Anwar, serve as timeless collections of the Dean standing up for his constituents. And for me, those speeches and Don's leadership are a template. He showed us how to lead and how to fight and how to hang in there. So when he saw the same attacks levied at projects in my home state of Minnesota, he came to my defense. Don will leave a legacy on this panel that will never be equaled. His advocacy will serve as more than a memory, but as a model of how we need to defend our districts. And today, as he looks down on this institution for generations to come, he will see us in the Dean's mold fighting. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Anyone? Mr.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Wagon, I'm sorry, didn't see. Didn't.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
So I came to admire Don Young. He was my mentor, and I was heartbroken when he passed away, quite frankly. And I have a whole collection of Don Young stories, but I thought I'd just narrow it down to a couple of three. When I was first elected in 2014, and a couple weeks after we were sworn in January of 2015, he called me in and he said that he was going to be the chairman of Indians, Insular, and Alaska Natives, and that he'd like me to be the vice chairman. And so he says, so here, this is how we're going to do this, honey. We Indians and Alaska Natives, I will take care of. I want you to handle all other islands. What do you think of that? And so I said, yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Your agenda is my agenda. Well, there was another time he and I did an event together in Alaska, and a Samoan chief came up and wanted to take a picture with me. So I said, great. And you know, your congressman is right here, Don Young, and he can be in the picture too. And the Samoan chief said, no, he can't. I don't want him to be. And I said, why not? Well, you're my congresswoman. And I said, how long have you lived here in Alaska? 30 years. I said, believe me, Don Young is your congressman, and he can get a lot done for you. So from then on, the Samoan chief got to know Don Young, and they became friends from there on in. But I also learned while I was up in Alaska that the second most widely spoken language in the Anchorage public school system is Samoan. So that was pretty amazing. The last story was when we went fishing. We left out of Seward. I think Bruce Westerman was on that trip. So we went out to catch some fish, and then the captain said, well, what do you want to catch? Salmon, halibut, rockfish, you name it. And so we went out to some spot, and then we were told how to fish and pull. Everybody caught a fish except me. And so Don Young started to rib me. Well, this great fisherman from the South Pacific didn't even catch a fish. You know. So may he rest in eternal peace, and we will all remember him for a very long time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Sir, recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will miss Don. He was a mentor to me. I'll never forget the way that I met Don. It was one of my very first receptions as a member of Congress, and my staff had told me that I needed to meet Don, that he'd be in attendance because I'd be working with him on the Indigenous People Subcommittee and Natural Resources. And so I was standing talking to someone, and my right hand was in my pocket, and I felt someone come up behind me and grab my hand and bodily pull it out of my pocket. And so I turned around, a little outraged, right? Because this is not something that normally happens to you at a reception. And it was Don Young, and he said, young man, it's disrespectful to have a hand in your pocket when you're talking to somebody. And then he introduced himself, and I thought my first reaction was, oh no, this is the man that I'm supposed to meet, that I'm going to be serving with. And so I asked him quite politely, I assured him, no disrespect was intended. I said, why, sir, is it disrespectful? And he said, well, you might be holding a weapon. And when you conceal your hand that way, one never knows. And it wasn't until later that I realized that Don might have a reason for thinking this, because with Don Young, if he had his hand in his pocket, you might always wonder if there was a weapon in there. But he was a wonderful man. Really gave us some hope that maybe Congress can return to the way it used to be, where statesmanship was prized over partisanism and where the parties could work together. And, the unifying principle that I think Don brought to everything that he did was whatever was best for his constituents. And that's an ethic that I certainly am going to hope to emulate, and one that I think is an admirable legacy for him. So I'll miss him.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Mr. Graves, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first, I want to thank you for taking a minute to honor Don Young. There aren't many people, I think, that deserve the attention that Mr. Young has received, having his body lay in state in National Statuary Hall, and the memorial service that we had for him last week. The man served 50 years or almost 50 years here. It's incredible. Chaired this committee, chaired the Transportation Committee. And, I said this on the House floor the other night. People talk about term limits a lot. And look, I support term limits, and I think that there's some people who get here that should be term limited at about their second week. But Young, the guy, nearly 50 years and never, ever, ever stopped fighting for Alaska. He didn't. And it was always his first, second, and third priority. And one of the things up here, anytime any legislation, even remotely touched or affected his state, people knew. Even though he was one of 435 votes in this body, people knew not to cross him, not to try and do something that was going to adversely affect the state of Alaska. His efforts to work on both sides of the aisle to make sure that Alaska's interest first, and again, second and third and fourth, and I think America's interest fifth. It's something that I think all of us should reflect upon with the long history that he had here, the incredible success. I had this number written down, and I don't remember it anymore, but something like 123 laws that he passed in his time here, just remarkable. Think about how many of the people here have passed, and you do the math and think about the progress that he made, no matter who was in the White House, no matter who was in the majority in this body. He just did an incredible job. I had the honor of working for him for a while, and just a great man to work for, a very unique style, but just a huge loss for this committee, a huge loss for this body. But there's no question in my mind that the House of Representatives is a better place, that there are hundreds of better members of Congress. Somebody did the math. It was like he served with 700 members of Congress, or some incredible number, just because of the amount of time that he was here. And also, I got to give a shout out to the Young alumni team, just hundreds of men and women that served under him. And I'll say it again, I think he made them better people by the experience of working with him. And I know it's a huge loss to the state of Alaska, a huge loss to this body, and a huge loss to the Young alumni team. So really appreciate the honor of having the opportunity to know him, work with him, work for him, and big loss for this body. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Graves. Mr. Fulcher?
Thank you,
sir?
Mr. Chairman. And when I first came into office 3 years ago, one of the people that I asked to spend a bit of time with was Representative Young. And I had a one-on-one discussion with him, and I said, okay, jump in your Wayback Machine and go back to, decades ago, 1970s, 1980s, and tell me what has changed in this body over that course of time. And he took off and he had a whole list of things that were quite interesting to me. But a couple of points that stuck with me was he held up this thing and he said, one thing is instantaneous news. He said, every time you come out of the committee, every time you come off the floor, by the time you step off, there is someone who's published a story about what just happened, and you need to overcome whatever that message is. And oftentimes it's not correct. So the instantaneous news was one thing. Another item that he pointed out that stuck with me was simply airplanes. I said, airplanes? He says, yes. People go home on the weekends now. Even if you live a long ways away, you travel home. We used to play in the Congressional Softball League together. We used to take our spouses to dinner on the weekends. Russ, we used to know one another. And the message there was, I thought, pertinent because I think we have lost some of those relationships that's impacted how we govern. And that was something that will stick with me throughout the course of my time here, and perhaps just a little bit of a reminder that we can do a little bit better job of getting to know one another. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else wish to be recognized, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a moment to honor Don Young and appreciate you giving that opportunity for us to do so. What possibly could be said, I'm sure that has not already been said. Don Young was a legendary figure, a giant of a figure, physically and otherwise. And if you've ever been in his office, what amazing stories can be told around his office alone. But I was extremely honored for several years to be in a Bible study with Don and to be able to see and hear his heart from that perspective is very endearing to me and something that I think a lot of people probably didn't see with Don, but he had a real tender heart for the Lord and was very much aware of his shortcomings and his personal need for grace and mercy that only the Lord provides. And that was just a part of Don that I personally thoroughly appreciated and enjoyed getting to know him at that level. But certainly we're going to miss him in this committee, but far beyond this committee. His laughter and he's one of a kind. And so, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to have those brief remarks, and thank you for allowing us the opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, Louis Gomer here.
Mr. Gober, please.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving this opportunity. I really was blessed to be sitting next to Don Young for many years. Having not been chairman or ranking member, and yet growing in seniority, I've had a long time. I got to be next to Don, and that was an honor and privilege. He is such a great American, such a great Alaskan, and as others have said, Alaska and the country were number one priorities for him. And for that reason, he was always anxious to have people visit Alaska. He took people on trips out to Anwar. He wanted them to see that the pristine beauty of Anwar was not reflected in the relatively very small area which the Carter administration set aside for drilling. He wanted people to see that you could drill there and it really wasn't going to affect anything that grows, because things couldn't stay there and live. It wasn't a good living habitat. It was a perfect place to drill. He wanted people to see that and see that if they view commercials that say, oh, look at Anwar, they're not talking about the area that was designated, again, back in the late 70s for drilling by one of the more liberal administrations to that time. So anyway, it was all based on his desire for what was best for America and what was best for Alaska. And some in our midst and that have gone on to better jobs than being in Congress can recall if there was a misstatement about Alaska, there was nobody that was more ferocious in defending Alaska and what Don Young believed was defending Alaska's honor. He knew the state, he knew it completely. There wasn't an area he hadn't been to. And that just makes for a good representative. And Don Young indeed was. It was a privilege and an honor to get to serve with him, but even more so to spend so much time sitting with him, talking with him, and being his friend. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for a chance to pay tribute to a one-of-a-kind great American. And one other observation, he usually had multiple knives in his pocket. And so if he had his hand in his pocket, then he probably had his hand on one of those big knives of his. But with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gomer. And we all noticed that there was occasions when you were terribly silent during that time, sitting next to Mr. Young. And for that, I guess some people appreciate it, and for others, maybe not. But anyway, anyone else wish to be recognized? Seeing no other requests, thank you, and thank my colleagues for their kind words about Don. All deserved, and it's a small honor to a great legacy, and all of us appreciate your words. Now, we're going to turn to the business at hand. We are meeting today to consider five. The committee will come to order. We're meeting today to consider 5 bills. All have been properly noticed and circulated electronically, along with copies of timely filed amendments, and will be available in the committee's repository at docs.house.gov. Late amendments are circulated electronically. Pursuant to committee rules, members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend their remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. And without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to committee rule 3I and the House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. Document amendments or motions must be submitted to HNRC Docs email from a House email address so they can be circulated to members of the committee that are joining us remotely. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise, and I strongly recommend that members joining remotely use the active speaker and thumbnail view. Otherwise, they will not be able to see the members here in the room. And I also recommend that members pin their timer so it remains visible. Members experience any technical problems should immediately contact the staff. And Ranking Member Westerman, I believe you have an opening statement. Sir, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to again thank you and your staff for your assistance over the last week as we have honored the life of Congressman Don Young, and in addition to the opportunity in this forum to share our memories about Congressman Young, the committee did make hearing room 1334 available, and we hosted nearly 100 former staff of Congressman Young and Alaskan dignitaries during his lying in state ceremony, provided them a place to watch the ceremony, to grieve together, and remember the life of a remarkable colleague and friend and member of this committee. At the time of his passing, Congressman Young was serving as Republican ranking member of the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States. He was a tireless advocate for American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and he leaves behind shoes to fill almost as big as the state of Alaska itself. As we move forward, I'm proud to announce that our colleague, California Congressman Jay Obernolte, will serve as acting ranking member of the subcommittee. I have no doubt Congressman Obernolte is up for the challenge, He's already served the subcommittee this Congress as vice-ranking member, and with this new position, I know he will continue to be a passionate advocate for indigenous peoples across America. I look forward to working with him, and I'm grateful for his leadership. Now on to the business of today's markup. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to see that we're getting to use the committee room for a markup for the full committee. I've spent a lot of time in this room with committee staff, and it's good to see so many of our colleagues back in person as well. I believe the committee functions more effectively and efficiently when we are in the room together, and I look forward to the day when we end even hybrid markups and hearings and return to the in-person work of legislating that our constituents elected us to do. With our return to in-person business, I'd hoped we would begin by tackling the most pressing issues that our constituents face, namely the skyrocketing cost of energy across the United States. And although America produces the cleanest, safest, and most efficient energy in the world, Americans are now suffering the consequences of this administration's anti-energy agenda amidst rising prices and record inflation. The administration's policies have driven up energy costs to crisis levels and increased our reliance on oil and gas from adversarial nations. Instead of unleashing America's energy potential, President Biden ran into the arms of some of our most ardent foes of Iran and Venezuela for relief. I'm not sure about you, Mr. Chairman, but in a time of need, I'd rather be looking to Texas than to Iran. Gas and oil prices have risen steadily since President Biden was elected, and in 2021, energy production on federal lands and waters represented 25% of U.S. total crude oil and produced about 10% of the natural gas produced in the U.S. Since demand does not decrease just because the Biden administration decides to stifle production, hampering energy development on federal lands and waters has had a notable impact on domestic energy prices and makes the U.S. more reliant on foreign oil and gas. The Biden administration has not issued any new onshore or offshore leases to date, despite statutory requirements to lease, and continues to delay issuing thousands of permits and rights-of-way. If the administration had issued new leases in 2021 and addressed its permit backlog, new production could be happening. The fact is that the administration's anti-energy policies that prevent American development have been driving up U.S. prices since day one. This committee is missing a huge opportunity by not meeting today or any time in the near future to discuss ways that we can work together to increase our domestic energy production and defeat Russia's global hold on energy and meet our own needs and the needs of our allies through the power of American natural resources. But it was with many things in life, this committee markup today does have a silver lining. We've got H.R. 1638 offered by Congressman Johnson, which would authorize the state of South Dakota to purchase approximately 266 acres of Forest Service. We've got legislation by Congresswoman Herrera Butler, which would create new opportunities for recreation and activity, and H.R. 6651, authored by our departed colleague from Alaska, Congressman Don Young, which creates an Alaska Salmon Research Task Force. I appreciate the chair's willingness to include these three bills in the UC package. I urge my colleagues to support them, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and with the cooperation of Ranking Member Westerman and other members of the committee, it appears that we have worked out an agreement on the 5 bills scheduled for markup today. On those 5 bills, before we begin, does any member have time, seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent package? No? Ms. Earl, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually
Okay, I don't
rise
see it.
to
They're
speak
beautiful flowers.
about the energy crisis currently being inflicted on our nation by failed policies of the Biden administration, which this committee continues to ignore. Our constituents are having to pay record prices at the pump when they go to the grocery store and on nearly every other purchase they make. This is directly linked to policy choices that the Biden administration has made at several different executive departments. From the Securities and Exchange Commission urging banks not to lend money to oil and gas companies, to the Bureau of Land Management not approving vital permits to drill on federal lands, to FERC making it nearly impossible to build new pipeline. The list goes on and on. In an attempt to cover his tracks and run from the consequences of his own actions, President Biden announced a series of proposals last week to try to lower energy prices. First, he proposes to release 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the next 6 months, a proposal that will have a negligible impact on prices and weaken our national security. The reserve is not designed to be used to cover up for a crisis that we have brought on ourselves, as this is the case today, but for when a real international crisis takes place at the heart of the world energy market and the United States cannot secure energy from any other source. The second step he announced was the so-called use it or lose it tax on federal land lease to energy companies, a completely ludicrous proposal that will willfully ignore the situation on the ground where many producers cannot begin operations due to permitting backlogs at the BLM, the supply chain crisis that is making it extremely difficult to build necessary infrastructure, and the labor shortage in the trucking industry that hinders the ability to move the product to market. Mr. Chairman, by not having a single hearing in this committee to examine this crisis and not including a single bill in the markup that addresses it, this committee is putting blinders on the concerns of our constituents. We on this side of the dais have solutions to increase energy productions, that will lower prices for our constituents, like my bill, the American Energy Security and Transparency Act, which would restart the leasing process and provide much-needed accountability to the permitting process at BLM. Unfortunately, we continue to be ignored by our Democratic counterparts. Time is of the essence. My colleagues across the aisle must change course away from their keep-it-in-the-ground mentality, which has failed the American people and led to record energy prices we have today. Energy producers in my district are ready and willing to rise to meet the crisis we face. They just need the tools to do so, which are being denied by the Biden administration. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Whitman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the bills on the UC agenda, and I agree with Ranking Member. There are some good bills there, but I think what we see today, unfortunately, is a missed opportunity to address an issue that is in the forefront of folks' minds across the United States, and that is rising energy prices and addressing the issue of why we are today more dependent on foreign sources of energy than we've been in the past 4 years. It is incredible that the importance of this issue isn't being stressed by this committee. This committee has, I think, an obligation and a duty to address legislation that takes us to a point of American energy independence. We have the ability in this country to be independent of buying Russian oil, of buying oil from countries around the world that don't like us, and to make sure that we are sending a clear message as to what we are going to do to make sure that our economy gets back on track and make sure that we address inflation. And there are several bills, Mr. Chairman, that I hope that this committee would take up. The American Energy Independence from Russia Act, which has been put forward by Ranking Member Westerman and Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, assures that we develop our own sources of energy here, so we're not buying Russian oil. I think those things are incredibly important. Requires an energy security plan to be put forward by President Biden in a 30-day period to make sure we have a clear pathway about how to achieve that. Also, the Unleashing American Energy Act by Representative Jerry Carl from the great state of Alabama, that essentially requires that 2 leases per year, 2 lease sales per year in the Gulf of Mexico are put forth so that we can make sure that we get back to producing energy in the Gulf. I know I was down in Mr. Graves' district not long ago, and I was appalled to see dozens of drilling and exploration ships anchored up, not doing anything. And literally every ship in the Gulf that is normally exploring and developing wells is anchored up. They're just not doing the work. And it's not like there's not oil there. And it's not like there aren't opportunities to do that. If we had lease sales and if we had a timely permitting process to where permits would be issued, it would be a different story. And we hear a lot about, oh, there are thousands of leases that are out there. And first of all, there has to be the opportunity to explore and determine if there's oil on those leases. If they are, then there has to be a permit that's issued. And the Biden administration, during its time, has issued one permit on those leases, one permit. And by the way, the courts overturned that permit. So in total, there have been 0 permits issued. So you can have a lease, but you cannot develop the oil on that lease without a permit. So I would argue that these bills would allow us to debate these issues about how to make sure that we ensure energy independence for the United States. Those are in turn related directly to our national security. They also are related directly to the absolute barbarism that we see by the despot Vladimir Putin and what he is doing against the Ukrainian people. There shouldn't be an instance where a penny of money from anywhere around the world is going there. The United States has an opportunity not only to have energy independence, but also to help other countries that today buy energy from Russia. We ought to be working with them. They ought to be buying American energy where they know their dollars will not be supporting the barbarism, the treachery, and the absolute crimes against humanity that are going on there in Ukraine. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity. I hope that you will allow these bills to at least have a hearing for the debates to occur, because I think it's incredibly important. I think the folks across the United States demand that, and that is an obligation of this committee. It's an obligation of this Congress. It is our constitutional duty to do such. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Stubbard, wish to be recognized? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in support of all 5 bills moving by UC. You know, this Natural Resources Committee moves mountains. We have jurisdiction over some of the most pressing issues facing America today. And these bills are important. They really are. But I promise you, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Days like today are an opportunity to move legislation, Mr. Chair, that will impact the lives of all Americans. And I'm pleased that we're not considering the double NEPA legislation that has now been pulled twice. There is a mining project in my district on its 18th year of consultation, permitting, and litigation. Doubling this timeline would be ridiculous. However, this committee needs to consider legislation today that would bring down the skyrocketing costs of energy. For example, why don't we consider on this panel how this administration has yet to approve one single onshore lease? As I mentioned last week in an EMR meeting, the White House press secretary said there are 9,000 leases approved. And a couple days later, she changed that to 9,000 permits. Mr. Chair, maybe we could have someone from the White House testify as to whether or not they know the first thing about oil and gas development. Because on this panel, we know that one single approved permit to drill does not equal oil shooting up from the ground. It takes multiple leases across several parcels. Seismic studies completed to ensure there is enough oil there to warrant drilling. And then approval for the rights-of-ways, approvals for the methane, approvals for applications for permits to drill. But what happened to all those approvals? In January of 2021, the Biden administration halted every single one of them with a single pen stroke. Joe Biden chose to stop approving energy. For those that were already in process, the administration decided they needed a central planning-style master leasing plan based in D.C., based in Washington, D.C., instead of going through the regional offices like they always did. The only lease sale held under direction of a Louisiana federal district court in the Gulf of Mexico featured record interest and millions in revenue from bonus bids. And what happened next? Another district court vacated the sale, and this administration chose not even to appeal, all the while ignoring the statutory required 5-year plan, which calls for 3 more lease sales.
So maybe, Mr. Chairman, we can consider legislation today that would reaffirm commitment to the rule of law and hold both onshore and offshore leases. Because the fact of the matter is, gas prices have skyrocketed under this president, and it started long before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. When Biden took office, gasoline was on average in my district $1.87 a gallon. It has steadily increased and now sits nearly at $4 a gallon. So what does the administration suggest? That we start pumping and drilling for more oil. But the same administration paused all approvals, doesn't know the difference between a permit and a lease, and isn't appealing the court ruling for the only lease sale offered. So, Mr. Chair, I'll close with this. I look forward to supporting the UC package here today. These are good UC bills that mean a lot to the communities they serve. However, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. The gas crisis is truly punishing American families and small businesses, and we, as a House Natural Resource Committee, need to do something about it. So let's urge this administration to hold lease sales, finish approvals, and allow American workers to unleash America's energy and get us back to energy independence and dominance. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Recognized, Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you,
Sir.
Mr. Chairman. And appreciate the bills before us today and just the consideration of that. And as we look at these and future bills, I think it's just pertinent to point out that energy policy is economic policy. Energy independence drives our domestic jobs, exports, and growth. Energy policy is also homeland security policy. Our domestic production prevents the need to purchase for our enemies, thereby fueling their nefarious intent. And we can't forget that energy policy is also environmental policy because the practices in the U.S. for harvesting and developing are the cleanest in the world. So just a reminder that I think all of us need to take heed to, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's very disappointing at a time when our nation needs it the most that our energy security is being compromised on a bunch of decisions that have been made by the administration and that they have been self-inflicted. What we saw on the first day of his administration that President Biden rescinded the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. And while most of the nation ends up suffering because of the loss of that 800,000 barrels a day of additional crude that would have been produced, the Montana region and local states are suffering even more. Montana alone would have received $60 to $80 million annually from tax revenue from that pipeline coming through our state in some of the poorest counties across Montana, where $1 to $3 million a year of additional revenue would have funded schools, it would have funded roads, it would have funded hospitals, it would have been a tremendous asset to those communities, not to mention the jobs that it would have provided. Additionally, that pipeline was going to provide an on-ramp in Baker, Montana, to allow 100 to 150,000 barrels a day of Montana and North Dakota crude oil to be transported to our coastal refineries as well. So it would have been domestic product. At the same time that we rescind the permit for the Keystone XL, we are going out of our way to purchase crude oil from tyrants around the world, beginning with Vladimir Putin, who we all been witnessing conduct a war in Europe that was unnecessary, that was unprovoked. Meanwhile, we're purchasing 600,000 barrels a day of crude oil. Now, the House has made the decision to go ahead and pass legislation to stop that from being imported, but instead of focusing on the opportunities that we have right here within our own country to generate these resources, this administration continues to go around the globe and look for these resources from other tyrants and other dictators that would do nothing more than to undermine democracy itself in other regions. And I just don't understand it. We have the ability with a package of legislation that has been brought forward by the ranker, Mr. Westerman, to develop our own resources, to open up the oil and gas leases on federal lands that have been closed down, that nothing has happened with, to start permitting the actual drilling and development of those resources that the permits have been slow-walked for the last 12 to 14 months since the Biden administration took place. And at a time when we see the escalating energy costs for those on the lowest end of the income scale that can afford it the least, we could be doing something about it right here in our own country, and we're not. We have yet to go through the growing season that my farmers and my ranchers are going to have to pay $5 a gallon for diesel fuel to try and get their crops in the ground, and then this fall to try and harvest them. We're seeing the escalating cost everywhere across the nation, and it hurts everyone who goes to the grocery store or tries to just fill their tank up to go to their job on a daily basis. So, Mr. Chair, what I would ask is that we take consideration of that legislation that has been brought forward by the minority so that we can bring this to the House floor so that the United States Congress can do something to address the high cost of energy that's impacting everyone across our nation at a time when our national security also needs it the most. Thank you very much, and I would yield back.
Benalti, sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the effort by both sides of this committee to pass this piece of bipartisan legislation by unanimous consent today. I think that's an indication of the way the committee should be working. But I want to join my colleagues in calling for a hearing on the American Energy Independence from Russia Act, which has been introduced in part by the ranking member. This is what's front of mind for our constituents today, the cost of energy in the United States, particularly the cost of gasoline. The estimate is that inflation is causing the average family in America to spend an extra $5,000 this year and an additional $2,000 on gasoline. And just to highlight the human cost of this, these are costs that are borne by people who are just trying to put food on the table for their families. I represent a large number of constituents who have to commute large distances to get to and from work every day. They don't have a choice as to whether or not they are going to buy gasoline. They're being forced to buy it. I had a town hall last night in which I heard some of the heartbreaking stories from constituents of mine about how they're struggling to meet this cost increase. And I struggled with how to tell my constituents that the problems that they're having have been directly caused by their own government. And it's a terrible thing to have to say, but we're facing a classic macroeconomic situation where we've got a supply and demand problem. Demand for energy has picked up as we've emerged from the coronavirus pandemic. Supply has not. And the predominant reason why supply has not here in the United States is that our government, our federal government, has declared a war on American energy. This has got to stop. And I think it can be stopped on a bipartisan basis. I think we all share a concern for avoiding the increase on the reliance of fossil fuels. It's certainly something that in this committee, Mr. Chairman, we all share. However, I think it's also a misperception that solving this problem for American consumers would result in a dirtier environment. Mr. Chairman, we create energy here in the United States cleaner than any country on the planet. And by curtailing production here domestically, we are forcing consumers to increase reliance on foreign energy that is produced in a way that's worse for the environment than if it were to be produced here. Countries like Venezuela, whose oil has a 50% greater life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than oil produced here. Countries like Russia that still flares their methane. The atmosphere does not care where these emissions occur, and by forcing them to occur overseas, not only are we increasing the cost to American consumers, which we are, not only are we decreasing our national security, which we are, but we're also making the planet dirtier because those emissions will be greater when that energy is produced. So, Mr. Chairman, this is the House Natural Resources Committee. This is the appropriate committee to be discussing questions about whether we should exploit the natural resources here in our country. And I would urge that this committee have a bipartisan hearing on this topic because it's a topic that the American consumers expect us to be discussing, and it's a topic, I think, that in fairness to everybody and in equity to the bipartisan process that we're honoring here, that we should accomplish. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Sir, Mr. Carl? Recognize, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't expecting that, obviously, but thank you, sir. That's pretty quick. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad we're moving forward with a few bipartisan bills. That's very encouraging to me. Today, which one, obviously, that includes Don Young, which we're all going to miss, Mr. Don, his loud mouth. But I think there's some of these bills that are missing, and I want to point them out to you. Last week, the Republicans on the committee introduced 6 bills that would address the energy crisis our constituents are facing today. The gimmicks, the Band-Aid solutions that we're seeing from this president is not cutting it. We're not getting anywhere on relieving these gas prices, and we've got to focus on the end users, which are our constituents. We need longer-term solutions to increase our energy independence and bring costs down for the American people. That's what these 6 bills that we introduced last week would do. We should be marking up all 6 of these bills, including my bill, the Unleash American Energy Act, which would require 2 lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico. The courts found Biden's moratorium on these new lease sales illegal last year, but this administration lets lease sale number 257 get stopped by environmentalists, which increases the price of fuel. And these groups are without schedule of any lease sales in the future, and that's dangerous, Mr. Chairman. My bill would provide relief to Americans and provide certainty to the oil and gas industry in the future, and that's where we're at. We don't need to be destroying their businesses. We should be helping them develop those businesses. I urge the markup of these 6 bills, and I yield my time back. Thank you, sir.
Recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I echo my colleagues. I like the way that the representative from Minnesota put it. We can walk and chew gum. I'm going to share some of the same comments, but I am grateful we were able to pass these 5 bills today through unanimous support. I've always appreciated the opportunities that we have had and to find that consensus. I know that's hard work, and in today's political climate, I know that's difficult work, and I have a lot of respect for you, Mr. Grijalva, our chair, and for Ranking Member Westerman to be able to find that consensus. I've benefited from it. My state has benefited from some of the bills that we've been able to pass here through that directly relate to Utah, and we're doing more of that today, so we need to celebrate that. But the inevitability is that the American people are going through something right now that has been directly caused by the decisions made in Washington, D.C. And that's just something that our founders never wanted. And I appreciate California Representative Mr. Obernolte for talking about the town halls that he's had, because I'm experiencing the exact same thing. In fact, I was in a committee, we were in a forum that we had run on the GOP conference side that the Ranking Member Westerman put together on energy, and I literally was in that when my wife sent me a text message picture of the gas pump. And she said, and this is my wife who, for better or worse, tries to stay out of all the politics to keep herself somewhat sane and happy, and she said, "What are you all doing back there?" That was the moment that I knew that the decisions that are being made in Washington, D.C., and the tactics and the approach that President Biden has taken were directly impacting every single American. Back home in Utah, I hear about energy prices from everyone. And it's cost the average family, the average Utah family, and I get we have larger families than most, the average Utah family and the average vehicle, over $110 to fill up a tank. It's unacceptable. We're feeling this when we heat our homes, when we drive our cars, and we purchase groceries. And most notably, our farmers and ranchers are feeling this. We rely on them, yet their input prices are skyrocketing out of control. From those of us who come from energy-producing states, we know we can do better. I was thrilled to join my colleagues last week in introducing and co-sponsoring legislation that will get our country back on track. I'm on 2 committees here in my freshman term, and it's on armed services and natural resources. There's a couple of us that share those same committee assignments, and we have addressed so much of what's going on right now in the world through armed services, and we need to be doing that on this committee. It's an honor to serve on these 2 very important committees. My bill, the Promoting Energy Independence and Transparency Act, would end the logjam that Biden administration is creating by requiring any pending permits for which required reviews have been completed to be issued within 30 days of enactment. Let me break that down. We are not saying we don't want an environmental review. We are not saying we don't want to go through a process to establish and permit and allow for these permits. We just are saying, once we're done with that, 30 days. Get us going. If you've done the environmental review, if we've gone through the process, 30 days. I guarantee you, if I could have my Democrat colleagues on the other side in a debate talking about this, we would not politicize this. This is a simple process, and we just want transparency on making sure that we can move this forward so the American people have some relief. I'm proud to be working on legislation that will protect American energy independence. It's more important as ever as Russian aggressors affect the world's oil and gas supply. We've got several bills in the hopper that we would love to have an opportunity to discuss. The other important energy bills, they're introduced by my colleagues, Representatives Van Dyne, Rosendale, Harrell, Graves, and Carl, will take important steps to remove barriers to domestic energy production. Americans need energy, and Americans produce energy cleaner than anywhere else. It's time to stop slow-walking the approval process, and it's my hope we can move to consider these bills and others like it soon. Thank you, and I yield back.
Wish to be recognized? Mr. Graves, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the legislation today, as you mentioned, it has a unanimous consent agreement and expect this package to move forward. I mentioned last time this committee met, this committee has jurisdiction over energy. We are the Natural Resources Committee. I want to read a quote from the Secretary of Energy, who says, on March 9th of this year, so yes, right now, we need oil and gas production to rise to meet current demand. Yet all you've heard this administration do is go out there and members of Congress in this committee, go out there and blame Vladimir Putin for the gas hikes and electricity hikes, to go blame 9,000 permits that are sitting around as if people with record oil prices would sit on stock and not want to produce it and sell it at the highest price they can. Mr. Chairman, this administration, when President Biden was campaigning, he said, quote, we're going to phase out fossil fuels. He said, quote, I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuels. Let me say that again. I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuels, is what President Biden said. The Secretary of Interior, who sat right there at that table, said, quote, I'm wholeheartedly against fracking and drilling on public lands. Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, all these names right there on that side of the aisle, on your side of the aisle, they voted against an amendment that we proposed, in fact, multiple times, that said that the legislation that this committee was pushing could not result in an increased dependence upon energy from Russia, energy from China, or other oil cartels. You voted against it. All the Democrat members of this committee voted against it. Yet what happened? Under this administration, we saw 161% increase in dependence upon Russian crude oil. We offered an amendment that said that legislation can't result in increased reliance on energy imports. What happened? Every member, yourself, and Democrat members of this committee opposed it. We proposed an amendment. Here you all are, touting yourselves as environmentalists. We proposed an amendment that said that your energy policies could not result in increased global emissions, because what happens when you overly restrict activities in the United States, as you have done and this administration has done, it results in more activities overseas that, as Mr. Obernolte mentioned a little while ago, is contrary to environmental goals, because not only does it give people pink slips in the United States, it increases global emissions. Your side voted against it. And of course, the amendment that said that you could not increase energy costs for economically disadvantaged communities or increase the likelihood of energy poverty, your members voted against it. Congress Daily, just today, Congress falters in bid to ease pain at the pump. Headline today in Congress Daily, no, National Journal Daily, excuse me. This isn't a Republican publication, as you well know. I remind you, Mr. Chairman, we have a Democrat Speaker of the House, we have a Democrat Senate Majority Leader, and we have a Democrat President. When they say Congress falters, let's be very clear on who it is that they're talking about. The reason that we have people at home that cannot afford to fuel their vehicles, that cannot afford to pay their electricity bills. By some measure, we've seen numbers saying that 1 in every 4 Americans are having to sacrifice other priorities in order to cover energy bills. These are self-inflicted costs. And let me say it again. This White House and members of your side are out there saying, oh, this is a result of permits. This is a result of Vladimir Putin. This is the result of energy companies being greedy. If I wanted to make money, I'd be selling every drop of oil at these inflated prices that your policies have created. And so you create false narrative, false excuses, false examples, and then you don't legislate on them, but we rename parks and convey land. This committee has jurisdiction over solving the problem, over providing relief to those families that are struggling to make ends meet right now. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, it would result in lower global emissions. I agree with Secretary Granholm, who says we need to increase energy production to meet demand. We need to increase energy production to meet demand. That's what we need to be doing right now. 70 colleagues sent a letter to President Biden last year on June 7th saying, hey, don't waive these Nord Stream 2 pipelines. It took Putin going into Ukraine in order for that to happen. The president in his budget request explicitly says he's going to ban any Corps of Engineers project. Could be for flood protection. People aren't going to get flood protection if the project also results in lower cost for oil and gas. Lower cost for oil and gas. In other words, he wants prices to go up, and it's exactly what we're seeing. Mr. Chairman, look, I'm not going to tell you that our bills are perfect or our ideas are perfect, but I would like to ask you, Mr. Chairman, if you would make a commitment to bring up energy legislation that will help to relieve the price at the pump, the price that the electricity bills that folks are experiencing today, including, Mr. Chairman, I'd love to get your thoughts and work with you on legislation that would include renewable energy. Yield back.
It's expired, thank you. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, a while back we had a hearing when this energy crisis really started to explode. It's been happening since January the 20th, 2021, but with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the rapidly increasing energy prices, I said during that hearing that we need to be having hearings to address something that this committee definitely has jurisdiction over, and that's energy production in the United States. And I also said that when we get together, we're going to talk about energy because it's that important to our constituents, it's that important to our country. Mr. Chairman, an energy crisis is not a partisan crisis. It affects Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike. It's Americans that are paying higher prices for their energy. We talk a lot about oil and gas, but it's all energy. And I think our members are here. They're ready to work. They're ready to debate these issues. We just need to be either bringing up these bills that have been mentioned, or we need to be bringing administration officials in here for oversight hearings to find out what the truth is, to find out what the plan is, and to find out how we move forward. I think we all want a cleaner environment, and we all want energy security and independence, and we want to cut off the flow of U.S. funds to people like Vladimir Putin who are being fueled by the sale of energy to commit the atrocities that we see him committing every day on the TV and in the newspapers. It's time that we exercise the authority of this committee and start talking about the issues that are important to the American public. Like everyone else, I'm grateful that we've got some bills that we can agree on that are UC bills that really don't have anything that's disagreeable that we need to debate. But we need to be talking about these energy issues. We need to talk about how we do cleaner energy. We've presented bills. We filed 6 bills last week. We've been filing bills in the minority since this Congress began, and we've yet to have a hearing on them. Maybe the Democrats have bills they would like to file. I would love to come in and debate bills that the Democrat majority thinks would solve our energy crisis. Maybe they have a plan to be able to do that all with renewables, a plan to go with no new carbon emissions. I'm open to hearing those plans, but also hear my colleagues talk about how we got to lower carbon emissions, how we've got to electrify everything. And then I see actions from the administration and from Democrat majority in Congress that want to shut down domestic mining. You can't electrify a society when you don't have copper and critical minerals and elements to do that. Mr. Stauber talked about the Twin Metals mine in his district. It's got copper, it's got nickel, it's got cobalt, it's got palladium, and I think platinum, all in that mine, large deposits of it. And this administration withdrew the lease. And as Mr. Stauber said, this has been in the process for decades. Who do we go to for critical minerals and elements if we don't produce them here? And we are blessed with natural resources. We could produce all of these minerals and elements that we need right here domestically, creating great jobs for rural communities all across America. But instead, we're buying them from China that doesn't produce them sustainably, that doesn't produce them with the same human rights standards, with the same safety standards, and with the same environmental standards that we produce them right here at home, or that we could be producing them here at home. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and this committee room is where those questions should be answered. This is where the questions should be asked. It's where the administration should have to defend the positions that they're taking, not just have the president's spokesperson go out and make erroneous claims about permits and illustrate a total lack of understanding of how American energy is produced, and quite frankly, to show disrespect to those hardworking Americans who are producing energy every day. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can have a hearing on the energy crisis. I hope we can consider these bills that our members have introduced and any legislation that the Democrat majority would like to introduce that addresses the real problems of our country. We desperately need to have those hearings. I encourage you to do that, and I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else? Let me just briefly respond, and thank my colleagues for raising the important issue of gas prices and the drama and trauma in Ukraine to the Ukrainian people, and the effects of the effects that that's having across the globe, not just in the United States, in terms of the fluctuation of gas prices and the exporters of that controlling the market at this point. But the United States is currently the largest oil and gas producer in the world. The fact that we are a net exporter of oil, meaning we export more oil than we import. Nothing is, I think, is standing in the way of the U.S. oil production. And much to my disappointment, the current pace of drilling meets or exceeds the production under the Trump administration, which was a open door to that process and worked tirelessly for four years to deregulate and to streamline the process for the industry. And companies have millions of acres of public land at their disposal, and nearly 9,000 approved permits to drill on public land and explore. But the industry has not chosen to use these permits in many cases because they would rather return profits to shareholders and executives than invest in new production to bring down gas prices. The truth of the matter is, while the rest of Americans suffer, higher gas prices are better for those companies who hope for international oil prices to rise even higher. We invited 3 of those largest drillers on the public lands to testify before this full committee this week and discuss why gas prices are so inflated, but they all refused. I think that silence tells us what we need to know, that cries for more drilling and looser regulations and are not, is nothing more than, I think, the same age-old attempt by the industry to control the public policy on our lands and waters. Part of the discussion has to be not just the issue of how much more do we need to drill. The issue has to be also one of the things this committee has put at the forefront of the discussion, and I agree that the profile of this committee, thanks to the work of Mr. Westerman and myself and others, has risen in terms of our role in the issue of climate change and what we can do to deal with that very, very, very serious and real reality, and to wean ourselves away from fossil fuels rather than delay that process, rather than stall that process, rather than go through denial once again and ignore science and fact. We've chosen to take a route that begins to prominently place our jurisdiction in the role of mitigator on climate change and addressing that issue. And we'll continue to do that. And no doubt, the process of transition is a difficult one, complicated by pandemics, complicated by poor past policies for the last 4 years, and complicated by antique 1872 mining laws, complicated by the struggle and the horror that we see in Ukraine, and the effects on supply lines and the ability to get supplies, all that put together. I think the discussion does merit attention and will, but the discussion has to be within the context of transition, not just merely more of the same and forget the reality and the serious threat of climate change. With that, we're done with, as we've done before, I'll make a single UC motion to discharge the agreed upon bills. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration. HR 920, the Brown versus the Board site. HR 1638, the Gilt Edge Mine. HR 2626, the Pullman National Historic Park. And HR 5093, the Wind River site. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife and the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples be discharged from further consideration of HR 6651, the Alaskan Salmon Research Task Force, without objection, so ordered. Unanimous consent motion to report. I ask unanimous consent that the following bills be adopted in order of favorable report. HR 920 with an ANS offered by myself. HR 1631 with an amendment, number 1. HR 2626 with an ANS offered by myself. And HR 5093 and HR 6051 without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider are laid on the table, and without objection, the long title of HR 20 is amended. All members will have 2 days in which to file supplemental, additional, and minority or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I also ask unanimous consent that for any bill ordered reported today with amendments, that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted by the committee. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Mr. Westerman and other members of the committee. No further business. The committee is adjourned.